And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather here showing heavy snow along a front here over the western interior areas, rain and snow to the south. This low tracking northward, bringing pretty good gale force winds into Kodiak Island and starting to increase in wind later tonight for the Barren Islands, southern Cook Inlet area, and the western North Gulf Coast. Break behind this system, another one coming into the western Aleutians, and pretty light winds here along the southeast coast there under high pressure. And for tomorrow, dry day and light winds for, although increasing in the afternoon along the coast there. This front bringing gale and storm force winds Kamishak Bay, gales for the North Gulf Coast. Heavy snow with this boundary to the west here, low tracking northward, and that bringing more rain and snow, mostly rain in the Bristol Bay, Alaska Peninsula area. Colder northerly winds on the back side of that, snow showers from the Pribilofs down to the eastern Aleutians, and more light precipitation coming into the central Aleutians, but a stronger storm out there to the west on Wednesday. Tracks up to about this position, with the front bringing gusty winds and rain into the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula to the Pribilofs. Winds becoming west, and looks like gale force westerlies into the central Aleutians. Still looking at snow here over the western interior, but winds pretty light, and low pressure coming northward into the Barren Islands or so, with the front right up along the coast weakening now, so lighter winds with the system on Wednesday afternoon, and kind of a damp day for the southeast coast. And for the coastal water forecast there for the Panhandle, for the south coast, southeast winds 25 knots, and the north coast we've got 30 to 40 knot easterlies in the forecast for Tuesday, but much lighter by comparison for Lynn Canal, just 10 knots out of the southeast, 15 out of the southeast for Stevens Passage, and down at Clarence Strait, southeast winds 20 knots. And then for Wednesday, 20 knot winds for all of the inside waters, with some 35 knot gusts there for Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage. And for the south coast here, south to southwest winds at 20 knots, and the central coast south winds at 20 to 25 knots, and the north coast south to southeast 20 to 25 knots. And for the North Gulf Coast tomorrow, with that front coming northward, gale force easterlies at 40 knots all along the coastline there, up to 45 knots into the Barren Islands, and 50 knots out of the east for Kamishak Bay. Southern Cook Inlet, gale warnings, northeast 35 knots, seas 9 feet. Small craft advisories for Northern Cook Inlet for 25 knot winds. And Prince William Sound, east winds 30 knots. Those drop back to 20 knots from the southeast for the Sound on Wednesday. Lighter winds here for Cook Inlet, east to southeast 10 to 15 knots, south 20 for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, as well as the western North Gulf Coast. Small craft advisories for the eastern North Gulf Coast, south of 25 knots, southeast 20 for Prince William Sound. Gale warnings for Kodiak tomorrow, east winds 40 knots. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, east winds 35 to 45 knots. And south to southwest winds at 30 to 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And then for the day on Wednesday for the Alaska Peninsula, gale warnings, southwest winds 30 to 35 knots, southwest 30 knots for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, southwest winds 30 knots with seas around 10 feet. For the eastern Aleutians, gale warnings, northwest winds 40 knots tomorrow, west at 35 knots for the Adak and Atka area. In the western Aleutians, southwest winds 35 knots. Western Aleutians on Wednesday with that next stronger storm coming in. We've got 40 to 50 knot winds from the west and northwest associated with that. Southwest 45 knots for the Adak-Atka area. Gale warnings also for southwest winds 40 to 45 knots for the eastern Aleutians. And here for the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, east winds 35 knots. That's good for a gale for Kamishak Bay. And that area, northwest gales for the Pribilof Islands at 35 knots, north at 30, St. Matthew Island. And for the Yukon Delta coast, Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Southeast at 20 for Norton Sound on Wednesday, and just southwest at 15 for the St. Lawrence Island area. West to southwest 20 knots for the southwest coast, but gale warnings for the Pribilof Islands. South winds 35 knots, and gales also for St. Matthew Island for east winds at 35 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, we've got east to northeasterlies at 10 to 15 knots, but brisk wind advisories here for the western and central Arctic coast for south to southwest winds at 25 knots, and west at 15, becoming southeast 20 toward Barter Island, Kaktovik area, and then those will be east at 20 for the far eastern Beaufort Sea coast, and then northeast at 20, about 15 on the central coast. Brisk wind advisories here for the western Arctic coast, north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots, north 25 to 30 for the Chukchi Sea.